improvisationally connect your interest, and in pedagogical too. It's not just because you've brought survivors of the genocide into your classroom. Can you make a connection from that genocide and the problems of memory that are associated with bearing witness to genocide, to the loss of family and stuff, on one hand, and your issues about your mom's loss of memory and your interest in dementia. Dementia and genocide, you're on.
Well, first, thanks for having me, Al, and for hitting
and
it so deep. That might just be a home run, which I can't get to.
We only have an hour, so let's go deep from the start. Am I way off?
No, that's a great question. My answer is totally different, although I will actually catch up with your fly ball eventually. The actual reason that I'm so interested in the Cambodian genocide, other than the fact that I was in college when it was going on, and my only memory of it from that time was seeing a flyer on a college door that said, "Bring a bag lunch for Kampuchea." And I remember knowing that people were starving and thinking that that was a rather horrifying sign. But my son, Sangha, was adopted from Cambodia.
I didn't know
so
that.
Part of my family is Cambodian, actually. And so we went to Cambodia to adopt him. And I read a lot of the memoirs of people who had survived the Cambodian genocide. And then I realized that I wasn't teaching it, and none of my students is aware that it ever happened. So one of the people who'd helped us out when we went to Cambodia, Hong Lee Kui, who lives in Honolulu, is a genocide survivor. And so he's come to my classes several times to offer his witness to what happened. The first time he came, he traumatized my students so badly that the course was never the same. And the fifth time through, though, his story was very, very gentle. So it was an interesting transformation of his story through.
Alas,
through
typical
my classes.
of survivor witnesses as they over-adjust to
the response.
Uncomprehending hearers.
Right. So one thing that he said, he was talking about a woman who was murdered in front of a group of people for asking for more food, and he laughed. And the students came back to that over and over and over again. He laughed. How dare he laugh? Someone was killed. How dare he do that? And I think my response was something like, well, please come back when you've had that experience and tell us how you reacted to it.
You said that?
Yeah.
So they were doubly traumatized.
Yes.
Thanks a lot.
Something like
really,
that, I think
you really
I
went
said.
easy on
Yeah,
them.
well, I went deep.
You
like
went
you.
deep. That's what we're doing. You play shallow, go deep.
Anyway, so that's very much kind of the first reason that I'm interested in the Cambodian genocide. However, I think you're making a very valuable move between that and dementia, because in the book Dementia Blog, which has been published, I made a similar political move by way of saying that when the Bush administration was telling the American people that there were WMDs in Iraq, he was trying to affect dementia on the public so that people would, in a sense, forget their rational faculty and believe something that he knew was untrue, which reminded me actually of when my mother would look at me and tell me something like, your father was Irish Catholic and you went to Catholic school, and I knew that that was her life, not mine, because my father was Frederick Schultz. He wasn't Irish, he was German Lutheran. But I had this moment of thinking, oh my God, maybe I was wrong all along. Maybe my mother does know best. And it felt like that moment in the United States where we were being told things. Well, of course, what Bush did was essentially a rerun of what Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon had done in the 60s and 70s, which was to create a lot of euphemisms, to invade Cambodia without telling anybody, so that even the pilots who were bombing Cambodia, some of them didn't know that they were bombing Cambodia. They assumed they were still bombing Vietnam. If you read the book by William Shawcross, you'll find some of this out. So I think in the sense that forgetting is often a public act, it's something done to people to ask them to forget, demand that they forget, and then they act as if they've forgotten. That I think is a link.
There's a in the back of all this is a kind of what we might call Enola Gayism. That is to say, you're on a mission to cause devastation, but the only way to survive it is to forget right from the start. You know, it's what you were talking about in Dementia Blog. But since the working through of your responses to your mother's, the demise of her memory, you've gone wider now. So you're bringing in lots of other materials. Mm-hmm. So I want to stay with the surviving genocide. It's a very hard move to make in a poetics. It's an easier move to make in journalistic nonfiction, though you'll get hounded out because the proof of the connection is hard to assert.
Right.
But in a poetics, you have the license, sorry, that's one word, the liberty, that's another word, the creative facility, all that crap that allows
chutzpah.
All that allows you to do something that a reviewer would say, well, try to put that in journalistic prose and prove the connection between our inability to hear the survivor of a genocide and the, what shall we call it, epidemic of dementia that we're sort of not recognizing. So the poetry, poetic writing, prose poetry and so forth gives you a chance to make the connection. So I have a number of questions, but you can go anywhere with that. You know, do you ever wake up thinking I should be more logically responsible to make the connection, or wake up and say, on the contrary, I love the way the poetics allows me to play fast and loose and suggest the connection? Do you worry about the political, the claim, the risk of being deemed politically irresponsible to make the connection? Do you thrive in a genre where you can make the connection? How hard do you want to assert the connection without seeming like some kooky conspiracy theorist? And finally, and I'll stop after this.
You mean I'm not?
The relationship between thinking globally about politics and then knowing from your own family how vital it is to have a personal politics derived from your experience, in this case with your mother, and then have a new view of global forgetting that we do, and it enabling you to have a new kind of radicalism as you go around the world.
That is a lot of questions, Al.
Yeah, pick any.
Political connection, I guess maybe I do thrive in this fast and loose poetic journalism, as Kaya Sand calls it, that I think these connections are very worth making. Joseph Harrington has an interesting book about his mother's death and Richard Nixon's resignation on the same day, where I understand some of the people who read the book were saying, well, is this a parallel track, your mother and Richard Nixon? But what he does so well in that book is not to impose the parallel track, but suggestively to lay those two stories next to each other. So I think that's what I'm trying to do with my mother's story and the politics. But the Alzheimer's has gotten me into all kinds of politics that I didn't necessarily realize were out there, such as the politics of healthcare. Again, last night I was talking about how I discovered that my mother's Alzheimer's home, or the people who run my mother's Alzheimer's home, they're the Manor Care people in Toledo, Ohio, who once they once sent me an email to ask me not to use the names of the residents. So they were reading
first names?
They were reading my blog. I was only using first names.
Creepy.
So
they were reading your blog.
They were reading my blog because I put, Arden Courts of Fair Oaks or whatever in it, and so they were following up on that.
Alert every
They have a
morning.
Google alert. I've seen more than one healthcare provider on my blog site meter. Anyway, I discovered that Manor Care, which had started as a family business 20, 30 years ago, had been bought in the mid-2000s, whatever it's called, by the Carlyle Group, which is one of those global investment things that also buys weapons systems that they sell, to the Defense Department, kids' toothpaste, anything. And that one of the reasons they like to buy these places is that they usually have good real estate, and then they just turn it over, right? So I wrote a collage poem about that. They also bought the Magna Carta, which
The
was
actual
interesting.
Magna Carta.
They bought the Magna Carta in the middle of all of this sending weapons to Iraq. So the politics of it is out there, definitely, and is well worth looking at. But even there, it's like Magna Carta,
Right.
invasion of Iraq. Okay, I can't write a piece for the New York Times.
Making that connection.
Well, I could, but I don't think it would be as effective as putting that up against other things, like the fact that caregivers or actually people with Alzheimer's are sometimes sexually and physically attacked in facilities, not just manor care, but in Alzheimer's facilities. That kind of violence, and the violence that's perpetuated in the name of freedom and liberty and our heroes.